Hello, my name is Lisa Wolf with the Center for Humanistic Change, and this is our Choices, Chances, Changes presentation. It is about the heroin opioid epidemic, and it is intended for 8th graders. So what is an opioid? An opioid is a prescription painkiller that is used when people have extremely bad pain. These kinds of painkillers have been around for a very long time, but they were traditionally used only in a hospital setting. You did not get a prescription and take them home with you. In the mid-1990s, a company called Purdue Pharma claimed that they had a formula that was not as addictive, and they started to publicize this to the medical community and to the public, and we started treating pain as another vital sign. So you have vital signs like your blood pressure and your pulse rate, and now they added pain. And while these drugs were intended for really bad pain, what happened was they started being prescribed for a lot of things they really weren't needed for. So I have some names of opioids up there: Oxycontin, Vicodin, Percocet, fentanyl. There's also hydrocodone, oxycodone, Demerol, Tramadol. There's many different names, but they all are basically the same thing. I will explain later in the presentation how these work in your brain, but one of the biggest reasons that we have such an epidemic of addiction with these medications is not only do they block the pain signal in your brain, but for most of us, they increase the production of dopamine, which is the feel-good chemical in our brain. If you do something you enjoy with your friends, like hanging out or playing sports, or if you like listening to music, the reason you enjoy those things, the reason you feel pleasure, is because they release dopamine in your brain and you enjoy it, you like it, it keeps you coming back for more. Well, these drugs have that as a side effect of the pain relief. And this is what got a lot of people into them, addicted to them. The reason you should be prescribed an opioid is for surgery or a very severe traumatic injury, or maybe if you have cancer, or if you are at the end of your life, especially for an elderly person, they might have a lot of pain. But what happened is we started prescribing it for things like wisdom tooth extraction or sprains, things that really didn't need this level of medication. So at your age, you're at a point where you can involve yourself in your medical care and having conversations with your parents or with your doctor. So if you have a history of addiction yourself, or if addiction runs in your family, you may never want to risk taking these medications because there is that chance, or just because you don't want to. Maybe you don't want to take a chance that you could become addicted. Sometimes people must have these medications. Sometimes there is nothing else that will relieve the pain. But have an open mind, because doctors will tell us that most pain we experience can be adequately controlled with ibuprofen and Tylenol, so Motrin or Tylenol. Those drugs are usually enough to control people's pain, but these are here if we need them. So I always want to mention some other commonly abused prescription drugs, just so that you're aware. So anti-anxiety meds like Xanax, lorazepam, Ativan, those are some of the more common names that you'll hear, are prescribed for anxiety. A lot of us have anxiety. Much of that is very normal anxiety. But some people really can't have normal days unless they have these anti-anxiety meds. So a doctor may prescribe them. You just need to be aware that they are highly addictive, which means there is that potential for overdose and that potential to die from that overdose. Also, we see some kids, young people and adults, I should say, abusing these anti-anxiety meds because they like the way they make them feel. And that is a very dangerous game that they are playing. We see the same thing with the opioids. People without pain taking them because they like the high that is the side effect. Again, you're risking addiction, overdose, and death. Another class of drugs that we see people abusing when they don't need them would be ADHD medications like Adderall or Ritalin. If you have ADHD, these drugs help to calm you down, help you to focus, and you don't get a weird feeling from them. However, if you do not have ADHD and you take these medications, they're going to make you feel speedier, have a lot more energy, and help you to focus. And some people like that speedy feeling of being really, really, really wide awake. And that becomes highly addictive. And they might start to abuse these. One of the dangers there is more that the danger is of the addiction not being able to go through your day without them. And when you don't have them, feeling tired and depressed and lethargic. Someone with ADHD won't see that when they don't take it because their brains are different. So I want to point out that if you would be caught with anti-anxiety meds, ADHD meds, or opioids without a prescription, that's a felony. It is a felony to share them or to take them from someone, have them in your possession, or to sell them or buy them. So let's say when you're 16 and you're driving your car and you're stopped for some reason and they search your car, and that happens, it happens, and they find these medications in your car and you don't have a prescription, you'll get a lot of trouble for that. And there's a reason they do that. It is because they are so addictive and so dangerous if they are misused. So, just be aware this isn't just a health issue. It can also become a legal issue for people who start to abuse these medications. So a lot of people might wonder, why are you talking about prescription medications and heroin? Heroin is one of the most dangerous illegal drugs out there, one of the, if not the most addictive illegal drug that is around. So the reason is heroin and opioids act on your brain in an almost identical way, as well as your body. Heroin relieves pain and makes you high. Opioids relieve pain and make you high. And actually, heroin is part of the opioid drug group. I just differentiate between them as opioids being the prescription meds and heroin being the illegal drug to make it easier. So heroin is derived from poppy plants that grow in very warm climates, and most of the heroin in the United States comes from Mexico. So if I am a drug dealer and I have heroin, let's say I have pure heroin and it's in a bag size of like a sugar packet. That pure heroin would kill someone. So I'm going to mix it with other things before I sell it. They call cutting it. Well, I might mix it with baking soda, sugar, flour, baby formula. What do those things have in common? They're all white powders. And the heroin that we see in Pennsylvania is almost always a white powder. So I can take that little bag of pure heroin and mix it and get, say, 20 to 30 bags of heroin that I can sell. Heroin is extremely cheap. It's only $5 to $10 a bag. And this is what makes it very attractive to people with an opioid addiction. We also now know that most people who become addicted to heroin start with the prescription drugs. And it can be very innocently, they prescribe them for, let's say they have a knee surgery and they prescribe them and they get addicted and can't get off of them. Or some people experiment with these drugs because they don't think they're going to be the one to become addicted to it. And believe the hype. You can become addicted to opioids or heroin the first time you use them. It happens to people. So there's a picture of what heroin will often look like. And I want to remind you that when you buy street drugs like heroin, believe it or not, drug dealers are not the most reputable or ethical people. So sometimes they mix other things in there. They might mix in rat poison or household cleansers. They also might put other drugs in there. So fentanyl, you might have heard that word in the news a lot. Fentanyl also is an opioid. There's legal fentanyl, which is used in a hospital, and then there is illegal fentanyl. The illegal fentanyl is made mostly in China and comes over here only for illegal use. There's no medical use for it. It is also a white powder, but it's a much smaller amount of that that can make someone overdose and die. And it was the addition of fentanyl to the heroin supply in 2015 that started the increase in all the overdose deaths that we have been experienced over the last few years. Other drugs that might be added to heroin might be meth or cocaine. They also are a white powder, and they are different than heroin. Heroin is a depressant. It slows your body down. And when people overdose, it's because it stops their breathing. Meth and cocaine are stimulants. They rev up your body. And that interaction can be extremely dangerous together. But we do see some people doing this intentionally, or again, you don't know what a dealer is putting into your heroin, and they get it quite by accident. So I just want to point one other thing out. We have found right here in the Lehigh Valley marijuana that has been laced with fentanyl and other drugs. So a lot of people think of marijuana as being safe, and I can give you 100 reasons why I would disagree with you, but that's another presentation. But you just don't know what people are putting in it, because the people selling it to you don't know really what's in it. And you wouldn't know until you got sick or felt really different or you overdosed. So there are a lot of dangers out there with street drugs, which I'm guessing you probably knew already. So how can heroin be used? I'm guessing most of you know that it can be used with a needle, and you would be correct, right? I think that's what we often associate with heroin use. However, it can come in a powder form and it's sniffed. It can be mixed with water and then heated and inhaled, and we call that smoking heroin. And then, of course, there are people that inject heroin. So back in the 1970s, we definitely had an issue with heroin in our country, but the heroin back then was not really pure. So you couldn't get high unless you injected it directly into your body. So a lot of people didn't abuse it. You had to be pretty hardcore to be using heroin back then. Then we saw HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C come around, and people who used needles for drugs got sick, went to rehab, some of them died, and heroin use went way down. In the mid-90s, about the same time that those really strong painkillers were being introduced, Mexico started to flood our country with heroin, and they changed the way they processed it. Now it was really much, much more pure. So now you didn't have to inject it. You could sniff it as a powder, or you could mix it with water, heat it, and smoke it, or you could inject it. So let's say you've already tried marijuana and you know what it feels like to inhale something into your lungs. So if someone offers you that heroin or just says, try this drug, you just inhale it, you might not be as hesitant to do that. Whereas a needle, you'd say, no way, right? Or if said, here's some of this powder, you just sniff it into your nose, you might not be so afraid of that either, because it doesn't seem as bad because it's not injecting it. And this is how a lot of people have gotten started with heroin. And often, like I said earlier, starting with those prescription painkillers. So what is the most dangerous way? What's the most addictive way to use? What is more likely to get you addicted? Okay. And which way is more likely to kill you? Here's the bottom line. They're all addictive. It doesn't matter how you start. It is addictive in absolutely any form. And all are deadly. There are a lot of people who have overdosed and died, never having used a needle, only having sniffed it or smoked it. You can overdose and die that way, which is, it's terrible in any manner, but there was a lot of misinformation out there, especially 5 years ago when I started doing this, that a lot of kids thought as long as you didn't inject it, you didn't get addicted, and you didn't die. And there is no truth to it. Heroin is dangerous. The only way to not get in trouble with heroin is to never, ever try it. So I've been throwing that word addiction around. So let me explain this. Here's what happens when people use opioids, and especially when they start to abuse opioids. As I go through this presentation, there is no difference between prescription opioids and heroin when it comes to the addiction piece. Okay, so I want you to remember that. I think sometimes we think because it's a prescription, how could it be that bad? It can be that bad. So what happens is someone starts to use it, and the more they use, the more they need to use to get high. We call that tolerance. So let's say you start out with experimenting with alcohol, and the first time you drink a beer, you probably actually get tipsy on that. You might feel a little bit drunk. But if you continue to drink on a regular basis, you need 2 beers and 3 beers and then more to get that same feeling. And then you might try another drug like marijuana to get a different high. With opioids, physical addiction means you need more and more and more to get the same effect. So someone might start out abusing the prescription drugs, and then they go to the heroin because it's stronger, gives them a better high, and they might start out sniffing like 3-4 times a day, and then fast forward months, years, it depends on who you are and how your body reacts. Now you're injecting multiple times a day. I know a couple people who were injecting more than 50 bags of heroin a day when they finally got help for their addiction. So what happens if we take that drug away from someone, okay? So they're using a lot of it because they had that tolerance and they're using more and more to get high. And let's say they overdose or they're arrested or they just can't get their drug. We call that being dope sick. This happens with the prescription meds and with the heroin. It means having a terrible headache, sweating like soaking wet, at the same time having goosebumps, diarrhea and vomiting at the same time, exhausted but they can't sleep. They might start to hallucinate. They all talk about the physical pain, like that their muscles and even their bones feel like they ache. It's the worst pain they could ever have. And this lasts for 3 to 5 days. And this is what a lot of people in the midst of opioid addiction want to avoid. It is so frightening for them to have to go through this. And this is what will keep a lot of people using the drug in order to avoid being dope sick. After 3 to 5 days, it starts to get better, but it does take really months until they start to feel more like their normal selves. So this is one of the risks we have with it, with these drugs, and it keeps people using them to avoid it. There's also the brain addiction piece of it. So we're all born with those little Y-shaped opioid receptors in the brain. And if you see the blue dots, those are natural endorphins or dopamine. And when you take a drug, let's say, like, let me back up. When you do an activity you enjoy, your brain naturally creates that dopamine, like I said earlier, right? It's released and you feel good. If you're prescribed, let's say Vicodin because you had surgery on your knee, this person is taking it responsibly. It goes into those receptors, goes out into the brain, blocks that pain, but at the same time, they get a feeling of well-being, just feeling like everything's okay with the world. It's a feeling that your brain will crave if you keep using it. For some people, it's very, very seductive. So let's say someone starts to abuse these medications or heroin. This is both. So the brain on the left is normal dopamine production in the brain. The brain on the right is someone who is using opioids. And they're increasing their use because of that tolerance, taking more and more to get high. The brain is very adaptable. It will actually create more of those receptors so you can increase the amount of drug you take to get high. Now, eventually this is usually going to be over years of use, people will hit like a ceiling where they don't even get high anymore. They're just taking that opioid or heroin in order to avoid the withdrawal and being dope sick. So if let's say this person can't get the drug anymore. They have no source. Their brain has all these extra receptors that it created to continue getting high. It's making a little bit of dopamine on its own. Long-term users, often the brain will not make the dopamine anymore because it can't compete with the drug. And meanwhile, what you see is that brain is screaming out for that drug. This is why people who become addicted to these drugs, that addiction becomes their whole world. They lose their jobs, they lose their friends, their homes, their children, because their brain has been changed. These drugs change your brain physically and how your brain functions. And really, you lose all control over your choices. You have none anymore. Your brain is driving everything you do to be satisfied by getting that drug. So I want you to think, if you started to use drugs, and I think a lot of us, especially when you're your age, you're 13 or 14 years old, you're thinking, I'm not going to get addicted. That won't happen to me. And that's what most people think. Probably all people think that if they try drugs. I want to remind you that if there is addiction in your family, you have a higher risk level. If you deal with mental health things like anxiety, depression, you're more at risk of becoming addicted, because some people will self-medicate with drugs when they're struggling with those conditions. So the important thing to remember is, if you start using drugs, you're not the only one that's affected. It affects everybody who cares about you. Family members, friends, teachers, coaches. They really are affected by people using drugs. And you yourself might even know someone who uses drugs or is addicted to drugs or alcohol. And you know what I'm talking about, because it might be affecting your life. And the important thing is to know you are not alone. It affects a lot of people in our society. We actually have 24 million people in the United States that live a life of recovery from drugs. So, there are a lot of organizations out there. There's a lot of help out there, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But no, you're not alone. And in God forbid you start to use these drugs and find you're addicted, you're still not alone. There is a lot of help out there. But the only way not get addicted is not to do it in the first place. Your brain at 14 has another 10 years of maturation to go. Your brain's not fully mature till 25. Part of your brain that matures last is the prefrontal cortex, right here in the front of your brain. That's like the control center. So at your age, if you start using drugs, you're going to get that dopamine rush from the drugs. And your brain's going to say, yes, that feels great. Do that again. And this part of your brain that as an adult would say, hold on, the consequences can be pretty severe here, isn't functioning yet, not fully at all. So even though that's why you're more likely to not think through consequences, to kind of do those dumb things that we do when we're teenagers. We expect it of you. But just know, when you are playing with drugs, you are playing with fire. You really are. So I'm going to tell a quick story of Emily and Lexi. So Emily is on the left and Lexi is on your right. This is a picture of them in 8th grade. They were best friends. Shortly after that, Emily got involved with drugs. She started out with painkillers, marijuana, alcohol. Eventually, you name it, she did it: cocaine, meth, heroin, overdosed a few times. Life was just derailed. Lexi, on the other hand, had a goal in mind. She wanted to be a model, and she worked really hard towards that goal. And they really didn't talk or see each other much during that, because their lives were very different. Lexi, at the age of, I believe she was 20, did heroin with her boyfriend. To my knowledge, they were sniffing it. They were not injecting it. She was not a heroin user or known to be a heroin user or drug user, but she made a decision that day to do it. And they both overdosed and died. Emily, in the meantime, has gone into recovery. and has been sober for 3 to 4 years and is doing wonderfully. She goes out and works with people with addiction, trying to get them to go to rehab. It's devastating for Emily because she says, why didn't I die? I did a lot of drugs. I did a lot of dangerous drugs a lot of times, whereas Lexi wasn't. And that's the thing. You don't know what's going to happen to you. Everybody's body is different. Everybody's reaction is different. There's no way, or I should say safe way, to abuse any of these drugs. So who can you talk to? So what if you're struggling with something yourself, like you're struggling with school, something's going on, you're feeling depressed or anxious? Think about who you know who you can go to. You have a lot of caring adults, believe it or not. Sometimes you forget that there are a lot of really, really caring adults out there who are willing to talk to you and want to help you. If you're struggling with drugs or you're living with someone struggling with drugs, who can you go to? And what can you do if, let's say you're at a party and people are drinking and you're worried about a friend, they're not waking up, you think maybe they had too much. You might notice their breathing is slowing down. You know, they stood up and fell down again. And you really suspect they might be overdosing. What happens if you get in that situation? First of all, you're going to roll that person onto their side. That way, if they vomit, they don't choke. You're going to call 911 for an ambulance to come. Narcan or naloxone is a drug that reverses an opioid or heroin overdose. It does not work on other drugs. This can be purchased in a pharmacy. You do not need a prescription for it. If you would make a mistake and give it to someone and it wasn't an opioid, it won't hurt them. So this would be something you would probably have in your home if you have someone that you know is abusing these drugs, or someone who's even taking some of those really strong painkillers because they have to. They are that sick or have that much pain. You should have it on hand. So, you know, let's just go back to an alcohol situation. Roll the person on his side, you're going to call 911 and you're going to stay there with them, even if you're drinking yourself. Because if you do those 4 things or 3 things I just mentioned, the Good Samaritan law protects you. You can't get an underage, they can't get an underage. If in a few years you are abusing a drug like heroin, someone overdoses and you're using it too, you call 911, you stay there, you can't get arrested, they can't get arrested. We are not treating this so much as from the criminal point of view anymore. It's a healthcare point of view that we are approaching addiction. So I want you to tuck that away in your brain, because it's very possible that you could get into a situation like this, and we want you to save a life. So what if you're struggling yourself or a friend is struggling? We have the SAP programs in the school that provide support. Your referral might be online or it might be in your guidance office. Just ask someone. It is anonymous. So if you have a friend who is suffering with eating disorder, self-harm, something going on at home, or using drugs, you can anonymously refer them. And all this does is set up process in place that helps them. It is not about punishing. You can even refer your friend yourself if you are struggling with something. And then all the schools now put this into place, right? The Safe to Say Something, there is the app, and you can submit an anonymous tip. This has just been put in place this year in all schools in Pennsylvania, and it is saving a lot of people. A lot of people are getting the help that they need. You spend more time with your friends than you do with your family, and that's going to change that in that direction as you get older. You need to look out for each other. And I've heard many people now in recovery from drugs say, I wish someone would have told on me. I wish someone would have gone to my parents or my counselor and said, you know, Joe's in trouble, he needs help. It might have saved them years of heartache, years of loss, and for some people, the loss of their life. Okay, so don't be afraid to reach out for help for yourself or someone you care about. So we want you to make smart choices, give yourself and loved ones a chance to get help if you need it, and make positive changes in your life if you notice that you are going in a direction that's really not best for you. If you have any questions, you are free to email me. My email address is up there. We also have other presentations for middle schoolers on there. There's one about vaping and another current drug trends. Those are both for grades 6 through 8 if you're interested in those. But I thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope that you have a good rest of your day.